Greetings, friends. Juan Ingruski here, and this is the summer of 1944 in the Russian borderlands in the Kursk area. Just kidding. This is the weekly Russian Ukrainian War update about 100 years later in August of 2024. And this week we're going to go over the weekly updates of the war in Ukraine for the week of August 5th through August 11th of 2024. And if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian Ukrainian War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Now, we have a lot of big news this week. First of all, we're going to talk about the Ukrainian invasion of Russia proper in the Kursk region. Now, there's things that happen, when you follow the war daily like I do and, post weekly updates, and, you could kind of guess on what's going on. You kind of think you know what's going on. But the thing is that I'm not a person on the ground. I'm not in Ukraine. I'm not in Russia. I'm an American. And, so you don't know what these forces might be, what's happening in the behind the scenes. And sometimes in this war, something happens that just completely blindsides you. We saw, sometimes just something just happens. We saw this in 2022 with the Ukrainian Kharkov offensive that spontaneously collapsed everyone. We saw this in, when the Russians invaded Toretsk 2 months ago, or when they invaded Avdiivka last year. And, so there's some, the front was quiet, and then suddenly it came to life. And so the same thing happened here. If you told me last week what would happen this week, I would have never guessed the Ukrainians would have launched a Kursk offensive. So before we go over what happened. Let's go over what happened, and then we'll talk about why the Ukrainians might have launched this offensive. So let's talk about here. So, right now the Kursk Oblast is a oblast that borders the Sumy Oblast in Ukraine, and if you scroll out here a bit here, you can see this is the Kursk Oblast in full here. Starts about here and ends about right here. Now you could see that they obviously didn't invade the entire Kursk Oblast. They invaded at a certain point, right actually to the north of Sumy, and probably this was intentional because the Ukrainians would be able to use Sumy as a logistics hub as they invaded Kursk. So what happened was that basically at the beginning of last week here, the Ukrainians invaded and basically caught the Russians off guard. There was Russian border guards and things like that, but there were very little Russian troops in the Kursk area. Now, there's two sort of now the way this kind of unfolded is that the Ukrainians kind of broke off into various sabotage groups and invaded in various directions. So the first direction is in the Sudzha direction, as I call it, in this direction through the highway. And they tried to basically capture the first major town of the Sudzha, because then if they're able to capture this town, they're going to be able to then use this as the logistics point for further expansion in the Kursk region. So that's in the eastern direction. In the more western direction, they started moving a bit north towards this town of Korenevo here. This is another major logistics hub that if they captured it would be able to facilitate them to continue moving to the north. So, they invaded to the east here towards Sudzha and are basically trying to either get around it to the south and also to the north. They also went to the north here and are trying to outflank Korenevo. And so those are kind of the two major directions that they move towards. And as you can see, we'll talk about the progress they made. So first of all, we got a lot of this actually, the one thing that surprised me about this operation is the Ukrainians didn't actually make a huge media deal about this until a few days into the operation. And so they were actually very quiet. They didn't say they were going to do something. Anyway, but we did get geolocated footage of Ukrainians being in the town of Novoanovka here and Lyubomovka here. Basically, the Ukrainians were kind of showing off that they're in front of the signs of this towns here. And so you could kind of say that the Ukrainian defense line kind of runs along these two villages right here. They're able to, they're holding down to, these kind of, these villages right here kind of form as like a place where the Ukrainians are holding down the fort. Now, a lot of sabotage groups are actually going beyond that. A lot of sources are saying the Ukrainians are continuously, were able to move along this road and try to enter Korenevo here. And some sources say in the beginning they did enter it, but they got repelled. And so right now, one of the things the Ukrainians are trying to do is use this base of operations after they capture these villages to try to attack Korenevo here. But they have not been able to enter it yet or have a foothold, but they're continuously doing these attacks. What the Russians are doing is that they're trying to hold on to these villages up here, and basically hold the eastern flank of Korenevo so that the Ukrainians don't try to maybe outflank Korenevo from the north here. So the Ukrainians broke through here and basically established like kind of a first line of defense here. Well, the thing is, it's not really defense yet. They haven't like built in extensive defensive networks. They were able to capture this very quickly in the first day or so, but then expanding more outwards, they weren't able to consolidate as much as the week went by. This is what they were able to consolidate. Now, the initiative is still with the Ukrainians. The Russians are sending various reinforcements here, and it has significantly slowed down. Almost all the Ukrainian gains happened in the first 3 days of this offensive, and then in the last, few, 2-3 days, like 2 days or so, it's been the Ukrainians are still on the initiative, but they have slowed down significantly in their advances here. So. The one thing the Ukrainians are also doing is advancing to the west here, and there's battles for the town of Stagnovsk here. Now, it depends on who you ask. A lot of sources are saying that this town is still under Russian control, but most sources say that this town is being contested and is either in the gray zone or under Ukrainian control. This makes sense because, I think what the Ukrainians are trying to do is not just go directly towards Korenevo here, but also try to basically take Stagnovsk and probably also take these 3 villages, kind of have a road that leads back to Sumy, and then they're able to attack Korenevo not just from the east, but also from the south here. And that'll basically, because they want to get, just like the Russians, they want to be able to get it at different sides to take Korenevo. And then once Korenevo falls, this would give them the operational space to start advancing towards the highway here. Now, a lot of sources are saying the main goal of the Ukrainian offensive is to take the Kursk nuclear power plant. This area, it's in this area right here. So if you scroll out here, now this is a big deal. This is a very big gamble, and a lot of sources are saying that they actually didn't really have a, they were just kind of wondering like how do you say it? There wasn't really a goal here, according to some people. It was more like they were just trying to see what would happen, and even the top Ukrainian advisor said that the main purpose of this offensive was to basically give the Ukrainians an upper hand in negotiations. We're going to talk about like all this once we talk about what happened, but let's continue to talk about what happened. So the Ukrainians consolidated, captured these areas and been trying to advance towards Korenevo, advancing towards these villages, trying to advance to the south. And right now, the Ukrainians are trying to break, into the southern part of Korenevo, trying to break out more towards the more eastern part of Korenevo, trying to attack these villages. And some Ukrainian sabotage groups did reach these areas, but they weren't able to consolidate more than they were able to in these areas right here. So that is more in the Korenevo direction here, where they're basically trying to improve their positions to storm this town. However, the Russians have been putting a lot of troops in this area here, and sorry about that. Alrighty, so yeah, they're basically trying to reach Korenevo, but the Russians are holding onto this town because holding onto this basically prevents the Ukrainians from expanding their zone of control, because that is how you advance. Taking a village does not secure your gains. You need to basically take a major town so that you could have that as a logistics hub and also be able to have that as like a force of concentration or a force of strength, meaning that like when Korenevo falls, these villages will be hard to hold for the Russians, and the Russians will have to fall back to Reliskyk and try to hold the Ukrainians off further to the north, and then the Ukrainians will have more strategic depth to their advance here. So that is in the eastern part. When we talk about the western part of this advance, the main focus has been in the town of Sudzha here, and there's been a lot of back and forth there. Now, the thing about this town is that it's basically split into there's various suburbs here. There's various it's split by a river, the eastern part and the western part, and there's also various villages, and so when they talk about the battle for Sudzha, which is what the main kind of this is actually kind of one of the main focuses of this offensive so far has been, is that there's the town of Sudzha itself right here, which is contested, but when people talk about, they basically talk about the entire Sudzha agglomeration, this entire area right here for the most part. And in this case, so in terms of Sudzha itself, it doesn't help that the town itself is contested, but also that this entire Sudzha agglomeration is also contested. Now, if we look at the western part, on the western side of this river that divides it in two, we could see that the Ukrainians have captured the village of Gonorovka here, and we have seen geolocated footage of the Ukrainians being on this of the northern part of Solozhenitska here and Zolozhenitska here. So this village right here. So in terms of the more western part, these villages have been taken, and also let's not forget that these fields on the borderland. There was also a giant battle for this border crossing right here, and the Russian border guards were guarding it, and they were a lot of Russian prisoners were taken in this border guard crossing here. So, and then they were able to continue advancing towards Sudzha because, again, this is one of the main areas they want. This is a town that, again, as I mentioned, like Korenevo, would serve the Ukrainians massively in expanding their operations in Kursk. However, one of the main Sudzha itself, the center of the town, is contested. A lot of people are saying that it's like either in the gray zone or under Russian control, but the Ukrainians don't have full control of it just yet. And because of that, the Ukrainians are actually trying to surround Sudzha. One of the areas where they're more successful in this operation is in the more of the northern part. They've been trying to outflank it. And, instead of attacking it directly, which is being very hard, they're trying to advance to the north here. And then recently, since the northern part slowed down, they've been trying to advance toward the south. Let's talk about the north. The Ukrainians are actually kind of using something that the Russians have been using this rail line as an area to help secure their flanks here. And they were able to advance up to Malika, Loknovka, and Nikolaevka here. And right now, it's kind of hard to determine. A lot of this is the gray zone. It's not like these are hard front lines, where the Russians are pulling reinforcements here to try to reinforce their gains here. But we don't exactly know. These are kind of just based on geolocations, some map from various mappers on the ground, from sources on the ground. And the thing a lot about this is that there's a difference between Ukrainian reconnaissance and forces and Ukrainian brigade, the main Ukrainian force here, because reconnaissance force could go very deeply into Russian territory, make a bunch of sabotage and then fall back. And then, we might, for example, we saw early in this, we saw some sabotage groups going all the way up north, up to here almost. But the thing is, they weren't able to hold this and they had to fall back. And it wasn't like a main, it wasn't like this huge force that went there and were able to set up shop here. It was a couple dozen sabotage people who were able to wreak havoc here, and they fell back. And this is why the Russian telegrams were very up in arms about how they were more dooming here than usual, because they were like, oh, the Ukrainians are breaking through everywhere, and it's a complete collapse here. But again, that was just sabotaging force, and but the main Ukrainian brigades were only able to establish themselves more modestly. So where there's sabotage groups operating in the northern rear of Sudzha, operating in these villages, probably operating in these villages. But the Ukrainians are basically, from what I understand, kind of using this rail lines where they've been able to actually establish themselves. And they're trying to basically fight towards the village of Martarovka. This village right here. This is where the Russians have established themselves, because we know this because the Russians were holding this village and the Ukrainians were trying to attack it. And so the Ukrainians have kind of solidified themselves in this, behind these rail line in Kazachka Lonka here, and in these villages, and now they're trying to basically use these villages to go across these fields and reach Martinovka here. And taking Martinovka, which they've been trying to do for the last few days now, would be very disastrous, because then this would cut off the main highway connecting the Russian forces that are in Sudzha, in the eastern part of Sudzha, in these areas right here. So this would be disastrous if the Russians lost Martinovka here. But the Russians have been able to hold on so far, and they've been holding off Ukrainian attacks. So the Ukrainians are trying to move along the rail line up north here to try to continuously advance along the rail line, and can reach this highway right here towards Logov here. Again, the one, and try to keep pushing the Russians more north. But they're also trying to advance to the east here and cut off Martinovka, and then basically seal the fate of Sudzha and force the Russians to give this up. Now that the Russians have held the Ukrainians back from Martinovka, that means that the Russians are able to continue holding on to Sudzha, and since attacking it directly has been a pain in the ass, the Ukrainians are now trying to advance in the south here. Now, they took a bunch of villages here, the village of Gorno, Guavo, Karlovka, and this was on the western side of the Pisky River here. So obviously, these areas were able to get captured a lot more easier. However, this river basically held as a natural defense. It was hard to cross it. However, we saw some sources showing the Ukrainians are trying to storm Pelovka here. We saw some footage of the Ukrainians being in this village. So a lot of sources are trying to say they're trying to outflank and also we see the Russians or the Ukrainians trying to reach Martinovka and Sonoska here, trying to cross there's a river here, but they're also trying to reach the southern part. So the Ukrainians are trying to outflank Sudzha, and right now the Ukrainians are still on the initiative here. But again, the main goal here is to outflank Sudzha, surround it, and basically take it. And then basically the goal of the Ukrainians is to, once they have Sudzha, this will give them a starting off point to continue moving along this highway, which leads towards, which will allow them to start reaching the Kursk nuclear power plant. So that's what's happened. The Ukrainians made a great breakthrough. The Ukrainians, are, a lot of this is still in the fog of war. We don't know where. There's a lot of gray zone. There's a lot of, sabotage and force, which might show that the Russians or the Ukrainians are in one area, but really it's not like an actual force that's holding the area. It's to sow panic in the rear. And the thing, so this is all still in flux. This is a very new operation. This is a new front. And so now let's talk about why they did this. Now, one thing that the Ukrainians have been saying is that the reason why they started this is because they want to have a better hand in negotiations. Now, this makes sense, but the thing is that if you, why would they, it looks like they're saying, look, we'll take a part of Kursk Oblast, and then we'll exchange that for territorial concessions in the Novorossiya regions. Some sources are saying that they want to basically say, hey, we're going to go back to the pre-2022 front lines. So basically the front line would go something like this, and then also Crimea. But everything else would go back to Ukraine, and then they'd give Kursk back to Russia. But first of all, that's a shitty deal for Russia. But also, why would they? The thing is that the Ukrainians spent their best brigades here. These weren't just some like in other border incursions. What happened here was that the Russians have been using, or the Ukrainians have been using, some of their elite brigades that were actually trained in the West. I believe it was the 22nd Brigade, the 82nd Brigade, and they're using Bradley Strykers, Martyrs. They've been using a lot of equipment here. Western production, some of their best equipped and best trained units here to make this breakthrough here. Now, the thing about invading here is that, well, how do I say this? When they've invaded here with their best units, this means that they seriously, but they call this the last gambit of Zelensky. The reason being is that, the Ukrainians are have been getting pushed back in the Donbass for the last few months, and the Ukrainians have made no gains in this area. So the Ukrainians are trying to make a final like hurrah. And this is not now. One thing is also PR. They're trying to boost the morale of people, and in that sense, that might work. But like, is that really worth? Like a lot of Ukrainian sources are saying, why are you wasting some of your best strategic reserves to make to try to take some villages and towns in Kursk, which will inevitably, because the Russians could draw a bunch of troops here, and they'll be able to knock you guys back to Sumy. And so basically this might be knocked out within the next few weeks or so. But like so it was that PR worth it to ruin your best brigades? They have also been trying to land. They've been doing like reconnaissance operations in the Kinburn Spit here in these areas, right here, and that led to dozens of special operations troops being killed as well. It's like why in the world would you like, why are you wasting troops for PR purposes? Like, there has to be a strategic purpose to it, besides just morale. But that's a lot of Ukrainian sources are like, why don't you use them to plug the holes that are being felt in Toretsk and Pokrovsk? Like, why don't you do that? And that's a good question. Now, morale is something, but now let's talk about other reasons. Another reason, again, I guess, about negotiations, but we talked about how there's no way, unless they capture all of Kursk Oblast somehow, or at least the nuclear power plant. This is another reason, is that they're trying to get after something like that will force the Russians to negotiate. And one thing is the nuclear power plant right here. If they capture, they're like, hey, if you don't make peace, we're going to make like a meltdown here and create like a nuclear catastrophe in Kursk. But but again, the nuclear power plant is like 50 kilometers away, and it's going to have to require a much more bigger breakthrough than the Ukrainians, did here in order to capture it. Now, maybe they can. It is still a possibility they reach the nuclear power plant, but it's very much, if they don't capture it, then basically all they have to negotiate with is a bunch of villages here, and it's like, okay, like, let's say they capture Sudzha. It's like, okay, but why would the Kremlin give up their land bridge or a majority of Donbass to get this town back? Like, so in terms of like negotiations, like, it doesn't actually, like, I get what they're coming from, because otherwise they seem like they're coming to a position of weakness. But the thing is that the Russians are, like, they already have their demand. Like, before, they're like, hey, this is our demands. We want all 4 oblasts. And it's not like you invading Russia is going to make them back down from that. In fact, this actually might piss the Kremlin off and make them demand even more. Might make them demand Sumy or Kharkov, to make a border zone here. Now, the thing is that, so I think this is actually would backfire. It seems like instead of like forcing the Kremlin to come negotiate with you from a position of strength for you, it seems like they'd be more pissed off and like would not actually give a shit about your positions and actually would demand more. So in terms of negotiations, I feel like it'd be more of a likely to backfire than help you. And PR is like, okay, that we're successful in that, but like, I don't know, like, is that really like worth it, ruining your brigades when you could have used them to guard Pokrovsk or Toretsk better? I don't know. And then the other main thing they use is that it draws Russian reserves from Donbass to help plug the Kursk operation. That's another reason why they say they did it. And this is what we kind of said with the Russian operation in Kharkov. The goal of this was obviously to create a border zone here to push the Ukrainians away from Belgorod. But the whole point about that is that, that obviously failed. But one thing it did do is draw a bunch of Ukrainian reserves here. We saw Ukrainian reserves coming from Kherson, from all over Donbass, to try to hold off the Russians in Kharkov. Now, with that being said, they're like, okay, let's do the same thing in Kursk. Now, the thing about that, though, is that the Russians have a bunch of reserve troops that they could use now that they're on Russian territory that the Ukrainians don't have. So now that they're fighting on actual old Russian territory, the Russians could use their 100,000 strong conscripts army. They have a bunch of border guards, National Guardsmen, FSB units, and they could basically hold off this entire operation. And they weren't being used as much. The conscripts especially weren't being used in Ukraine at all. And so the Russians have troops they could draw from to hold this back, and they don't need to draw troops from Donbass. Now that's a good, that would have been a good goal, because then that would have slowed down the, stretching the front line would have helped, in terms of how do you say it? Stretching the front line would force the Russians to divert troops to this area. But the thing is, the Russians have reserves that they can now use now that they're fighting on Russian territory in order to actually plug this gap, and they don't need to draw troops from Donbass. It was a good attempt, but the thing is that they don't actually have to draw it from Donbass, because they already have the reserve troops in order to counter it. So. But who knows? Maybe Russian manpower is that fickle, and they will have to draw troops from Donbass in order to counter the Kursk incursion. So who knows? But from what I've seen, is that they already have reserves in order to actually counter it. So those are the reasons why they did Kursk. We talked about why this happened. This takes up a big part of this video. So if you want to, there's a lot to talk about. There's still things being cleared out in the fog of war. This isn't like the daily grind we see usually in these battles. So it's things are still in flux. Things are still getting figured out. Still trying to figure out how the Ukrainians were able to make such a big incursion. So yeah, this is this was happening in Kursk, and we shall follow this development. We'll see if right now the initiative is back with the Ukrainians, but it's slowed down significantly towards the end of this week, and we shall see if next week if the Ukrainians are able to hold on to this. If they're able to, we'll see how the front line is configured from here on out here. So yeah. Alright, so that's Kursk. However, just because Kursk has been happening doesn't mean that the entire front line stopped. There's still a lot of gains to be talked about in the Donbass here. So let's talk about where we usually talk about, in the Pokrovsk area. This is where the Russians have been making a lot of progress, and this week is no exception. They continue building on their progress week from week. Now, as we mentioned, the Russians are using this rail line to advance along it towards the village of Novy Gorivka. We talked last week about how what the Russians have to do in order to reach Pokrovsk, and that Gorivka, Novy Gorivka, and Selinovo form the Pokrovsk agglomeration. Basically, kind of hold these towns basically hold off the Russians from reaching Pokrovsk, and the Russians need to find a way to break through these towns in order to reach Pokrovsk and start encircling it, and Minigrad. Now, the Russians are continuously doing that. This week, basically, we saw that the Russians have fully captured the village of Sigurivka right here. We saw the Russian troops raising the Russian flag here. And they basically fully captured this village. And not only that, we talked about how the Russians captured the village of Vasola last week. Now, after they captured the village of Sigurivka, basically they've been using these two villages to start expanding towards the outskirts of Grigorivka. They have not entered this town just yet. However, sources are saying that the Russians have captured these kind of tree lines right here, and they have captured these tree lines right here to the north of Sigurivka. And they're basically trying to clear these tree lines here as we speak, because once they clear them, they'll be able to start entering Grigorivka itself on the southeast. No, in this area right here in the southern part of it. And again, this is one of the main towns that holds the Pokrovsk defenses, and if they want to, they were going to continuously try to encircle it and enter it from various areas. So the village of Sigurivka has fallen, and the tree lines to the north of Vasola and Sigurivka, and this basically lets them right to the outskirts of Grigorivka. Now, another main thing that happened this week is that the village of Zelanya has basically fallen, and clear-up operations are still ongoing. Sources are saying the Ukrainians are still in this area, but basically, the Russians have entered the farms, they have captured the residential area that, for sure, that's on the eastern part of the rail line, and basically the Russians are still mopping up this. Most sources are saying the Ukrainians have retreated back to Nova Zelanya and Zaitova right here, and are trying to hold defenses here, and are also trying to hold defenses in Mykolaievka here. So they've retreated back here, and Zelanya is now being cleared up. This also helps that, right now the Russians there's a road that connects it to Novoslivka Pershi. So now instead of having to rely entirely on the road that goes through Porez here, once the Russians clear up Zelania, they'll be able to use Novoslivka Pershi as. Let me look exactly where the road connects here. Yeah, right here. So the Russians are able to use the road from Novoselivka Pershi to Zelania, and then they could have a better supply situation in this area. The Russian my As the Russians continue expanding, they'll continue moving along this road. My theory is the Russians will reach Mykolaievka right here, and the southern part of Orlovka, and kind of do the same thing they did in Sigurivka and Zelania. They'll start trying to clear Mykolaievka and move along Orlovka and Zhuravka here. So try to take these three villages. And they'll also probably try to storm Nova Zelania to secure their flank a little bit. And so this will probably take for the rest of August, but the goal will be pretty much to reach this area. And then they'll reach Novigorivka. Now, storming Novigorivka is going to be, you might think they'll continue advancing along this rail line, but the thing is, the Ukrainians have some good, they have all these high-rise buildings right here that the Ukrainians could use to hold back the Russians. So my understanding is that the Russians will take, these three villages, but then will stop running along this rail line and start focusing perhaps on these three villages, try to cut off Gorivka and Novigorivka, and then also, this will also allow them to start attacking Gorivka from the west. They'll be advancing from the north here as well as this is happening, so they'll be advancing from the north, they'll be advancing from the east here, and basically attack Gorivka on three sides, and then we'll basically see a battle for Gorivka. They'll be trying to clear this town, and they'll probably stop. And then once Gorivka falls, let's say then the front line will go something like this, then the Russians will probably try to start advancing here and reach this rail line behind Novigorivka right here. They'll probably, stop something right here to the south of Mitrograd and south of Pokrovsk, kind of hold the line here. And then they'll start advancing into Novigorivka from the south, and then, they'll be able to attack it from three sides here. Now, if the thing about this is that the Russians want to start attacking it from the south here. If they want to go from Mykolaievka towards the south here and try to outflank Novigorivka from the west, the last area where they have to go. The thing is that there's now the town of Selidova. They have multiple these what were they terracons here that overlook these fields and also these high-rise buildings. And they're able to overlook the Russians that are trying to outflank Novigorivka from the west here or from the south. So the only way I could see this is that they have to clear Gorivka before they start clearing Novigorivka, and they'll reach the rail line here. They'll be here. And then they'll start clearing Novigorivka, because then once Novigorivka falls, they could start advancing through these fields and start reaching this rail line right here. And then once they reach this rail line, they're going to try to clear, and this as they reach the southern parts of Pokrovsk, they'll start battling for Selidova and start trying to encircle it. But in order to do that, the Russians will also have to advance through here and start. And there's also the town of Ukrainska here, which will be a big thorn in Russia's side as they try to encircle Selidova and everything. So as you can see, there's a lot of things the Russians have to do in order to reach Pokrovsk. But these three towns need to be taken before they can start encircling. But if these three towns fall, which might take the rest of this year, the Russians will be able to reach the southern outskirts of these areas. And and then this will basically make them reach the outskirts of those of these cities, basically, because that's what it is. Pokrovsk is a city. And then after that, I'm assuming the Russians will probably start trying to advance from the east here, try to clear out these fields right here, and they'll start probably trying to get to the north here, because they'll also try. There's a lot of areas. Pokrovsk, the thing about this is that, as the Russians expand towards Pokrovsk, there's still a lot of work to do, just to reach the southern, reach the southern part of it requires a lot of work. But then they have to reach the eastern part of it, the north, and they're trying to put the squeeze on the city, and there's still a lot of work to do to reach Pokrovsk. Now, there's also here the Russians have made some progress here. The Russians have captured the village of Lysychansk right here, but there's basically nothing there. They managed to capture some more tree lines right here, and capture the tree lines between Ivanivka and Lysychansk right here. Right now, sources are saying the Russians are planning on storming Severodonivka here, which makes sense. We talked about how the Russians are using the Kerensky-Turets River as a natural defense. In terms of Ivanivka, most sources are saying that this village has been completely captured. The Russians have captured the center part of the village this week, and basically now clearing operations are ongoing for the center. And now the Russians are trying to reach the northern part of Gordievka. We talked about how they're going to put the squeeze on this is the first town that needs to fall. Sorry. Before they so they can continue advancing towards Pokrovsk. In order to do that, they need to take Novotoretska and see Sterdaganovka here and clear these fields right here, so that they can start entering the northern outskirts of Gordievka right here. So we shall now, that's what's happening in the Pokrovsk area. The Russians are still making steady progress. By next week, we'll probably see, right now the goals of the Russians to clear for this upcoming week will probably be to take these two villages along the Kerensky-Turets River and reach the northern outskirts of Gordievka. They'll also try to finish clearing up of Zelania and start battling for Mykolaievka and Orlovka and Nova Zelania. And so that'll be where the next clashes will be. And this is probably where the Russians will focus for August. But so we shall see how the Russians develop their offensive in the Pokrovsk direction here. One area where the Russians have made a lot of progress as well is in the Toretsk area. This is another area where the Ukrainian defenses could really use the help from the brigades in Kursk. Let's talk about New York. This is where a lot of the changes happen. Now, New York is one of the main suburbs of Toretsk, and if New York falls, then the flank of Toretsk will be severely threatened. New York kind of holds the Russians back from being able to start encircling Toretsk, and this week the Russians made a lot of progress. Now, we saw the Russians actually raising their flag in the school right here. Maybe it was right here. But the Russians are raising their flag here, and basically a lot of mappers basically said this entire area was captured by the Russians. However, later they said that the Russians were counterattacked and the Russians just fell back to more better positions in the southern part. They didn't actually take this entire western part, which would have cut off the main Ukrainian defenses in the center part of New York, especially in this factory. So we're still trying to clear up what's happening in the western part of New York, because we saw the Russians raising their flag here, but they said they got kicked out. But for the most part, basically, this area, the Russians will probably do another attack and recapture it, and this entire area will be captured by the Russians. So, New York is starting to get encircled here. We also have some footage showing that the Russian, or not footage, but mappers have been changing their maps, saying that the Russians have taken this area and moving more to the west of Yegorivka right here, taking these tree lines right here. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians are also clearing up, this area right here. So the Russians are trying to push the Ukrainians away from New York and reach towards the next Ukrainian defense lines that are in this area. These villages were meant to protect New York from the flank, but now it's the main defenses that are trying to hold that will hold the Russians back from advancing and clear and allowing the Russians to basically push the Ukrainians through the fields towards Konstantinivka here. So a lot of the Russians are making good gains in New York, not just in the western part, but in the eastern part. And it seems like a lot of sources are saying the Ukrainians are giving up this pocket. We were talking about how because of the Russian advances in this area and in Zelania, we're going to be able to make a pocket and encircle all the Ukrainians here. But it looks like the Ukrainians are giving up these positions. This week, we saw a lot of mappers are basically saying that this entire area right here, I think, right here, was given up by the Ukrainians. They basically gave up these pre-2014 trenches and retreated back towards the residential area of New York in the eastern part right here. So now this is where the fighting is ongoing. So they basically gave up these trenches, and now the Russians are able to start, and this helps the Ukrainians. It's good for them for giving it up, but to save their forces. But again, this this doesn't they're still in risk of encirclement in this area, because if the Russians could close this pocket right here, then the Ukrainians guarding these trenches will be encircled. So there's still a lot of, if the Russians aren't held back, which a lot of sources are saying that the Russians have captured up to this area right here. Now, however, they said because the Ukrainians retreated, they're able to start doing counterattacks and trying to contest this residential area right here. So this entire area right here is being fought over, and we don't know the exact combination of it. We just know the Ukrainians are in control of more the northern sector right here, but along with the factory. But this southern residential area right here is being contested by the Russians and Ukrainians. But as you can see, that if the Russians win this contesting, then then they can start advancing towards these reservoirs. And if the Russians manage to do another attack and capture this, you could see that they could start encircling the Ukrainians in New York from two sides here. And then also the Russians from Zalania could reach these reservoirs and encircle the Ukrainians in these areas. So it's very likely if the Ukrainians can't hold on, they'll lose New York, lose these trenches, and the Ukrainians will have to fall back to Toretsk and Shcherbyanovka and Petrovka here. Again, this is why the Ukrainians could have used their best combat brigades here and forced the Russians to continue fighting for New York for a couple more month or two, because then this will prevent them from continuing their offensive and capturing Toretsk and in turn Donbass. There's also been a lot of changes in the suburbs of Toretsk right here as well. We talked about the fall of Zhelania last week, and there's been no really big changes in Zhelania since then. Looks like the Russians are consolidating their positions. I would try to expect a storming of this Terrakon right here, so the Russians could have a better defense in Zhelania. But besides that, looks like the Russians are still consolidating their gains in Zhelania. But where the Russians made a bunch of progress this week is in Pivnichnya right here. And basically, this is a big change here from last week. Basically, the Russians have captured all the suburbs of Pivnichnya to the south of the Vololanya road. And so big part. Before that, what the hell? Oh, there we go. Before that, we thought that most of Pivnichnya was under Ukrainian control, and that only these high-rise buildings were being contested. But it looks like after the Russians took these high-rise buildings, the Ukrainians retreated this Terrakon and basically lost this suburbs. We also saw some sources showing that the Russians were combating Ukrainian troops in this area of Toretsk. Now, with that being said, this was the Ukrainians also counterattacking. So it looks like the Ukrainians are still in control of this area right here. But we basically saw the Russians consolidate positions, starting to take the northern part of Pivnichnya right here. And if they take these northern suburbs, these northern residential areas, they're going to be able to storm this Terrakon and take it as well. So a lot of big gains in Pivnichnya. So most of the town is now under Russian control, and right now the battling is going on for this residential area. And the Ukrainians are able to guard Toretsk because of these high-rise buildings right here. But the Russians will be able to kind of have their own defenses once they take these northern suburbs. They'll be able to storm this Terrakon from multiple angles and take it. And then I talked about this last week. I think the Russians won't continue advancing towards Toretsk, but will start trying to advance to encircle it. The front line will go something like this. And I think from New York, the Russians will advance along this area right here, and the Russians will advance along this rail line up here and start trying to encircle Toretsk here. But taking the suburbs of Toretsk is a big goal, because it pushes the Ukrainians away from Gorlovka and towards Toretsk. We also saw some advances in Druzhba right here. This is where the Russians have not made as much gains, but they basically captured this area right here. and also captured this street right here. So the Russians are now in control of about a third of Druzhba, and they need to take Druzhba in order to secure their gains in Panichnia. So, and then I think from Druzhba, this is where once they take the Tarakhans in Panichnia and Zelania, or and they'll be able to use this rail line and advance to the north here and start trying to encircle the Ukrainians in these fields to the north here. So, yeah, the Turetsk and Pokrovsk areas is very damning for the Ukraine. This is where the Ukrainians are losing a lot of of land. A lot of soldiers are holding off, and they don't have reinforcements. And this is why a lot of Ukrainians are like, why the hell are you opening up another front in Kursk? We really need the forces here. So yeah. Now let's talk about the South Donetsk direction, this area right here from Orezhina to Krasnogorivka here. There's the places where there actually is the most changes is in the Konstantinovka area, and let's zoom in here. Basically, the battle for Konstantinovka has started. The Russians have entered the town and are now contesting it, and most sources show that the Russians have taken the eastern part of Konstantinovka. And this basically gives the Russians a foothold here, and now the Ukrainians will have to contest the Russians in their own backyard here. Now, the Ukrainians have multiple defense. Since the Ukrainians have failed to prevent the Russians from entering the town, the Ukrainians now have to fall back. Now, the Ukrainians have a few areas they could fall back to. There's the center of the town right here. There's more than just one-story buildings here. They also have the farms to the south here, and then the farms to the west here. My theory is the Russians will try to clear as much of the eastern part of Konstantinovka as they can, and then they'll probably try to improve their positions in the fields to the south of Konstantinovka. As we know, we saw the Russians reach the road here last week, and so I could see the Russians trying to clear these fields right here, and then storm the farms to the south from two directions. And then once they storm the farm, then the front line will go something like this. And then there'll be the bloody battle for the center of Konstantinovka, which will be a big, where the Ukrainians will hold the line. Because if they lose the center part of the town, then the battle for Konstantinovka is basically over. We also saw some more, and again, they're taking Konstantinovka in order to cut off the supplies to Ugledar, which I believe will be the next focus of the Russian offensive. I think there'll be some massive Russian offensive here in the winter, if Konstantinovka falls. We also saw some more small gains in the fields here. The front line's getting closer and closer to the highway here. So, we'll see. We'll see how if the they already cut the highway, but, they want to push the Ukrainians as far away from, as close as possible to Ugledar so that the Russians could shell, what basically saved Ugledar last time was that when the Russians invaded Ugledar, the Ukrainians were using Vodanya and these mines to help reinforce Ugledar. But if the Russians are right here, they could shell the Ukrainian forces that are right here. Also this week we saw some changes in Orezhina. Once they took this town, they've been clearing the fields to the east of it. They took these fields right here. So they're trying to improve the fields to the east of Orezhina. These fields that are to the south of Velika Novosolivka and near Novodonetska are kind of contested. So the Russians want to secure their flanks here before they continue moving along this river here towards Marinka and Bogdanovka here. And then in the Zaporozhye direction, the Russians there's been geolocated footage of the Russians, I believe, in this area right here. And so this was the last kind of incursion. Like if you look at maps. We saw basically the Ukrainians were in this area right here, and we saw the Russians advancing in Robotina and kind of pushing the Ukrainians back towards Novodolivka. But this was the only area where the Russian where the Ukrainians were still holding out. But we basically saw that this area is probably already being cleared up, and the front line will be, they've already cleared the northern outskirts of Robotina, so they'll basically secure the eastern flank of Robotina, and my theory is that they'll continue advancing till they straighten the front line a little bit. There's like this continuous tree line right here that could probably, in my theory, basically be where the Russians will be pushing towards, because then this flattens the front line, and then I think that's basically where the Russians will stop. I don't think the Russians will continue advancing towards Orivka unless the Russian offensive in Zaporozhye is rumored is actually true. But yeah, so the fields to the east of Robotin are being cleared, and basically everything the Ukrainians gained in the 2023 offensive is being rolled back. In the Chasiv Yar direction, there's been actually no really big changes here, but we did get more geolocated footage of the Russians having at least a small foothold on the opposite side of the canal. So now it's being more confirmed, but there's been no really big changes here. But basically, the Russians are trying to solidify a bridgehead on the opposite side of the canal, so that they don't have if they don't have to cross it, and they don't want the Ukrainians fortifying it, because it's a natural defense both for the Russians and the Ukrainians. But once they cross it, it'll give the Russians a good advantage to, once they restart offensive operations towards Chasiv Yar in the future. And yeah, so that's the Chasiv Yar direction. No really big changes, just some more geolocated confirmation of the Russians being on the other side of the canal here and trying to solidify their gains here. In the Seversk direction, we basically saw confirmation that the Russians are advancing towards Perzhenia here, and they basically have entered the southern outskirts of Perzhenia right here. They're able to use the Bakhmutka River as a defense from the Ukrainians in Fedorovka, and so right now they're trying to clear out the southern outskirts of Perzhenia. So we got geolocated footage of the Russians now battling for Perzhenia, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians continue using this rail line as a defense to continue advancing and try to take the center of Perzhenia. And but again, they don't want to advance too far north because they still need to clear the fields to the east of it. But my guess is the Russians will kind of move north here, take the village of Perzhenia right here, and then they'll probably try to outflank the Ukrainians right here, and try to clear these fields right here. Because in the meantime, my guess is the Russians will also advance from Ivano-Darivka and along this rail line to take the village of Vimka, which doesn't exist anymore because it was wiped off the face of the earth. But then the front line will go something like this, and then the Russians will be able to take Perzhenia and then clear out the fields right here. So then the front line will look something like this. So, and then from here, the Russians will then probably start advancing, along this rail line here, and then converge here, and then the battle for Zanovka will begin, and then the front line will go something like this. Now, this is a bit of a, let's kind of like pour out here. You could see that the two advances that the Russians have been doing from Rozdolovka along this rail line, and then and then towards Vimka here will kind of consolidate right in the south of Seversk. Now this is this would actually flatten the front line a little bit, so the front line will go something like this. And so my bet is the Russians will, after they reach this point, the Russians will start trying to clear out the more western villages here, probably Satov-Pokrovsky here, Fedorovka, and kind of have some, have some space here. And then from here, the Russians will basically reach the outskirts of Seversk, and then the battle for Seversk will start. However, there's still a lot to do before they reach that point. But again, the advances in Perzhenia right here allow the Russians to start battling for this village and start advancing along this rail line. There's been no changes in the Liman front. And then there's been no changes also in the Kharkov front, actually. So this place is still kind of static actually this week. However, in the Kupiansk front, we have some changes. So let's talk about in the north here. So in the north, the Russians are still clearing. Again, we talked about how the Russians took Bashana. However, this is a very big penetration, and they had to secure their flanks here. So the Russians this week have captured another forest plantation to the north of Pashana and to the west of Tabivka here, and so they're consolidating to the north of Pashana, and securing their bridgehead area a little bit. One of the biggest changes also has been here. We saw some geolocated footage right here of the Russians being shelled. So that shows that these fields that are to the south of Berestova and to the west of Novoselivka have been captured by the Russians. And not only that, that means that the northern outskirts of Stematovka have been taken. And so now the Russians are not only putting pressure on Stematovka directly, they can now put pressure on it from the north. And this probably means the Ukrainians will, in Stematovka, will have to fall back, because the Russians are also in the south here, and the battle for these three villages is about to be over, and the Ukrainians will have to fall back to Lozova here. But basically, this would flatten the front line for the Russians and force the Ukrainians closer to the Oskol River. Yeah, and in Kharkov, the battle for the citadel for Volchansk is still going on. The Russians took back Globokha, but, they're just, the Ukrainians are in Lipsy, the Russians are in Globokha, and they're just kind of holding there. Yeah, so a lot of changes this week. The Kursk offensive, the Russians still pushing in Toretsk and Pokrovsk. The Russians making small and steady gains in Kupiansk and the South Donetsk direction, and in the Seversk direction. So in every direction, there's been gains in one way or the other. And we'll have to continue following this. This war to see how it goes. Again, there's always surprises. Every week we think there's something going on. We think we know what's going to happen, but then something big happens, like Kursk. Like, who knows? Maybe out of nowhere, the Russians just invade Gulelia Polia right here. Like, maybe, in a few weeks, we just see some invasion happen here, and we just don't know about it because this front's been quiet for, a long time. Who knows? Or maybe the Russians advance in Le Mans, or I don't know. There's always a big question on what's going on. So there's always the weekly grinds, but then there's something that could just spontaneously happen, like Kharkov or Kursk. So so that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Sorry for the long video, but there was a lot to go over. Be sure to subscribe to my channel if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian War updates. Be sure to like this video, comment your thoughts, and share this video around. So aim high and wander on.